So, John Locke, in the essay concerning human understanding, advanced his main claim, the main claim of empiricism, and that is that, as he says, all materials of reason and knowledge come from experience. The idea there is that the mind of the person at birth is, as he puts it, a blank slate. So this is his analogy. There are no innate ideas in the mind. So just as a blank slate doesn't have anything on it, but it has the capacity to be written on by somebody, information, right? Or pictures, or whatever that you want to put on a slate. The mind, from its beginning, is blank, and anything that gets in there from the outside. That basically means through our sense faculties, right? And so you can see this is direct opposition to the doctrine of innate ideas, that there are somehow pieces of knowledge or ideas innate in the mind. Okay? Right. So, how will John Locke make the case for this? Well, the way he's going to do it is he's going to have to explain the knowledge that we do have in terms of experience alone, right? And then after that is accomplished, he can cut out all the unnecessary baggage. Yeah, so the idea of the rationalists, or the main argument was that, for the rationalist, if you remember, was that we have kinds of knowledge which would be impossible if we depended completely on experience alone. And the examples that Leibniz gave, if you recall, were mathematical knowledge, logic, and general principles of ethics. Yeah, these are because they are universal propositions, right? And in order to know that a universal proposition is true, we have to know that it's true of every possible instance. And it's not possible to experience every instance, because there could always be instances which outstrip what we have experienced. And so the fact that such knowledge is both universal and, according to Leibniz, necessary and self-evidently certain, it's not possible for experience to underwrite that kind of knowledge, or to be able to give us that kind of knowledge. And so the idea there, the conclusion of the rationalists, is that somehow then our mind has a kind of innate or connection to reality, which is independent of experience and can somehow transcend the limits of our experience, right? And that for them must be because of innate ideas that we have independent of experience, and that somehow connect to the truth in a sort of unmediated way, not relying on observation or experience of the senses. Yeah. So that raises a whole other conversation, and you can see how that would lead to a great deal of, perhaps from the empiricist point of view, needless metaphysical speculation, especially if it's the case that all our knowledge can be explained by experience alone, or as originated from experience alone. So the project of Locke and the general project of empiricism will be to explain the knowledge that we do have, right, and how it comes to us by experience only. And once that's done, cut out all the unnecessary baggage, right, from the theory that may have accrued from the assumption or implicitly or explicitly that we have some original sort of innate knowledge. So some examples are, well, what we can cut out then are the, sort of theories of innate ideas. We may be able to cut out other metaphysical notions, like the idea of universals or forms, right? Which seem to indicate transcendence from the material world that we experience, right? Because experience is of particulars. So we recall that distinction going back into ancient philosophy, that what we experience are particulars, and according to the Platonist model, universals or forms are the realities that we actually can grasp with the intellect, as opposed to the mere shadows that are the particulars that we experience. So an empiricist would be able to keep those things out of his theory, right? Well, the term we use now sometimes is ontology. If you remember, we use the term ontology as the theory about being, and now sometimes people use the term ontology almost as if it's kind of a list of what you believe exists, right? So the idea here is that if you can keep your list of what you believe exists as small and efficient as possible, right? So that you only postulate that which you need to postulate in order to explain what needs to be explained, then that is a sort of theoretical virtue. If then we don't need the concept or the theory of universals or forms or such things in order to explain the knowledge that we have of the world around us, then we don't need to keep those ideas in our theory, and we can reduce the size of our ontology, right? Make it, more sort of efficient, I suppose. You could put it that way. All right. Well, we need to talk about some of the terms that were used, because Locke said that, right, all the ideas in our mind come from experience. So what is an idea? He says, an idea is whatsoever the mind perceives in itself, or is the immediate object of perception, thought, or understanding. So that can be pretty general, right? It can be something that you remember. It can be something that you actually perceive in front of you. It can be something that you conceive, right? Anything that's in your head, right? It seems like he's telling us this is what an idea is, yeah? And it turns out then that whatever knowledge we have is going to be discussed in terms of ideas in our minds, right? So what knowledge we have and how it got there is a matter of what kind of ideas we have in our minds and how they get in there. And so we're going to have a kind of a taxonomy of ideas, classification of different kinds of ideas. This isn't really, in that vein, it's a very similar process that had already started with Descartes, kind of a subjective internal look, introspection into what's in your mind. So the first thing that Locke does is he distinguishes simple from complex ideas, right? A simple idea is an idea which is not composed of any other ideas. Examples that we can give are like ideas of colors, black, white, maybe spherical, right? That cannot be analyzed into simpler parts. Maybe spherical is not really one, because we could probably give a definition of that, analyze it into simpler parts. Black and white are probably the best examples, and the paradigmatic examples of these are always colors. And this indication of that is that, you can't give a real definition of a color. You'd have to be able to point to a color, and the person would have to be able to actually see the color that you're pointing to in order to get the idea, because the idea, now the sensation of the color is here discussed as an idea, right? Um, so the idea of a stock option and the idea of black are categorized as both ideas, even though they're very different in type of, in this case, a color is a simple sensation, but we're now talking about it as a simple idea, right? And conceiving it in terms of this fact about it, that it's not composed of any other ideas. It's not made of any other ideas. I couldn't give a definition of black or yellow or red or white. Okay. And the other sorts of ideas are the complex ideas, though ideas that are made of parts, right? And that can be analyzed into different parts. Analysis, remember, again, is examining an idea in terms of its parts and how they fit together to constitute the whole. That's what we do when we analyze something. Something that doesn't have parts cannot be analyzed then. So that's what we mean now when we say that a simple idea is non-analyzable or cannot be analyzed. Complex idea can be analyzed because it has, and it consists of parts. We can understand it in terms of those parts. And that comes in, for Locke, three types, three ways in which ideas come together to form compounds or complex ideas. So there are simple compounds of ideas. So I suppose if we have an idea of a sheep, one example here is that we can multiply that idea, and we'll have an idea of a flock, right? A flock is just lots of sheep, yeah? So you just take the same idea and, multiply it, and you have a lot of them, and you have another idea that'll be a flock or an army or, any kind of group of things. Now, of course, a sheep is not a simple idea, and a soldier is not a simple idea, right? But an army is just a group of soldiers, and a flock is just a group of sheep. Okay. Ultimately, however, as we're going to see, all the complex ideas have to be built up from simple ideas, and that seems obvious why that would work. So we'll have to decide and figure out how the complex idea of a sheep can arrive, right? Because a sheep is not just a simple idea like a color. Well, there have to be different ways in which ideas relate to each other to form complex wholes. And another way that he gives is by ideas of relations. For example, the relation of larger than or smaller than, right? And he says that we get these ideas by setting two ideas next to each other and then comparing or contrasting them, right? So we already have two ideas, and by comparing and contrasting, we get ideas of their relations, right? Larger than, smaller than, whatever you want to think of. There's many examples you can think of, right? Ideas of relations. Of course, this is because, and a simplistic rationalist might argue against an empiricist. You say that all our ideas come from experience, but I know that you're taller than me, so I have this idea of taller than. Do you ever see any taller thans around here? I've never seen any taller than. What's that? And the empiricist can simply respond that, well, we get the idea of taller than by comparing two other things that we do experience, right? And so that's how we get the idea of the relation. Now the third one is the one that does the most work here and is the most controversial, and that is the proposed process of abstraction. Yeah? Locke says that we arrive at abstractions when the mind separates out a feature of an idea and generalizes it. We gain a certain character, we recognize a certain characteristic that a group of objects has in common, and we assign it a name. So that's going to have to be involved in our concept of sheep somehow, right? Because we have now a name which applies to a species, right? And we can say there's a whole flock of sheep. That means that there's many sheep there. And again, just as the rationalists going all the way back to Plato will ask, how is it that many of these can all be one? They must all share the same form, which is sheep, and so therefore there must be these abstract universals that are real things. And that somehow we grasp these with our intellect, right? And for Locke, it's not that way, and for the empiricists in general, they will always argue that, no, what we experience are particular things there, and when we experience that, through, again, this sort of ideas of relations, right? We experience or observe that they have similarities, and then we consider those similarities on their own, attach a name, and that's how we get the idea of sheep, right? So the idea of sheep is derived from our experience of the similarity of these otherwise diverse number of different objects. Yeah. Okay. And that's going to be the case with all the even more abstract ideas. Like we just mentioned, the example of a stock option, right? Or the ones that we see in front of us here. The idea of a compound, or an idea, or a relation, or an abstraction. All these are very abstract notions. And the empiricist's task then is going to be to show that concepts as abstract as these are ultimately derived from nothing other than one of these sort of processes operating on simple ideas, simple sensations that we have. Okay. And that turns out to be a bigger task than it would have appeared to be when one simply entertains the concept that all our knowledge comes from experience. Okay. So those are the two kinds of ideas, and the simple and the complex, and the three ways in which complex ideas emerge. The second thing we have to talk about are qualities, right? So there's a relation between qualities and ideas. Sometimes can be confusing because it's easy to conflate the two. We're supposed to keep them separate. So Locke defines a quality as the power to produce an idea in a mind, right? The power to produce any idea in our mind I call quality of the subject wherein that power is. Okay, so right now there is a yellow highlighter on my desk. Yeah. The sensation of the yellow color that I'm experiencing is the simple idea, right? As Locke has it. I can't define it, it's just the experience there. But it is in my mind, so it's a kind of idea. It's a simple one. Now, how did it get in my mind? From experience. There must be something outside of my mind that puts it in my mind, right? And for Locke, well, that of course would be the actual object, the highlighter there. And it then must have the power or ability to produce this yellow idea in my mind, yeah? And that power it has to produce the yellow idea in my mind is the quality of its being yellow, right? So there's an idea of yellow, and, well, initially we can say a quality of being yellow, right? But that's a special kind of quality, so we're going to see that when we look at the three kinds of qualities that he talks about. And they are the primary and the secondary and the tertiary, right? Quality 1, quality 2, and quality 3. All right. So, what are these? The primary qualities are such as are, as he says, utterly inseparable from body. Yeah? Anything which is a body, a material thing, must have primary qualities and cannot be without them. So, another way we can say that is to say that they are essential qualities of all material objects. It's impossible for any material object not to have it. And the examples of these are solidity. Any body has to be solid to some extent. Extension, it has to take up space. Figure has to have some shape. Mobility, meaning it has to be at rest or moving, right, one or the other, and if moving at some velocity, right? And he says, which I think we may observe to produce simple ideas in us, yeah? The idea of solidity, extension, figure, motion, or rest, a number. Okay, so for example, here's the highlighter, and it's sitting on my desk in front of me now, so put aside the yellowness of it, because that's, as we see, it's going to be a secondary quality, right? And the reason for yellow being a secondary quality is because it need not be yellow and it would still be there, and it would still be a body, right? In fact, it might not have any color at all. It could still be a body, right? And that's because all it needs in order to be an existing material object is to have a shape and a size, and as he says, some mobility and number. And these things are also ideas that are produced in my mind, right? If I reach out and grab the highlighter and squeeze it, I get the idea of its solidity, right? And simply by looking at it, I can see the extension, its shape, its size, right? And I can see that it's in relation to the other objects around it. It's at rest, it's sitting on the desk, yeah. And there's one of them, right? So all these things are inseparable from its being there, existing as a material object. If it didn't have a shape, a size, and solidity, well, if I were going to propose that it exists, I would have to concede that it's not a material thing. Yeah. So that's what a primary quality is. Okay. Now we contrasted that with the secondary quality, yeah, like yellow, right? As we're going to see, that's a secondary quality. And the reason for the differences, as he says here, the primary qualities are those that are in the things which have them, whether we perceive them or not, right? And, you know, we can discover them, but even when we're not observing them and we don't have the idea of the thing, it's still there. Yeah. Right. So, the idea is this. If I turn off all the lights and it becomes completely dark, right, I will no longer be able to see the highlighter, right? And in that case, for Locke, the highlighter will no longer be yellow, because its being yellow depends on my visual experience of its yellowness, right? But it would still have its size and shape and primary qualities. So the primary qualities are the qualities a thing has all by itself, on its own, regardless whether anybody is experiencing them or not. But a secondary quality is one which depends on some relation to a subject which is experiencing the thing that has it, right? And that's how he says it here. Secondary qualities are such qualities which in truth are nothing in the objects themselves, but powers to produce various sensations in us by their primary qualities, by the bulk, figure, texture, and motion of their insensible parts, as colors, sounds, tastes, etc. The ideas of primary qualities of bodies are resemblances of them, and their patterns do really exist in the bodies themselves. That's the primary qualities. But the ideas produced in us by secondary qualities have no resemblance of them at all. So, this is a familiar picture that we're taught, I think, in secondary school science class, maybe before that, right? The colors that we see around us of things in the world are a result of the light that is coming into our eyes, right, at certain frequencies, and and affecting the apparatus of our eyes and our visual apparatus in our brain, right? So the light is coming in to our eyes in that frequency because it's being reflected from the objects in a certain way, and the way it's reflected from the objects is depending on the microphysical structure of those objects, right? That primary qualities that Locke is talking about, as he says, the motion of their insensible parts. Yeah. So primary qualities are the causes of the secondary qualities. Yeah. Primary qualities exist in the things intrinsically, right? Independent of our experiencing them, right? But because they have the primary qualities they have certain power to produce secondary qualities in us. Yeah? Secondary qualities, now he's saying, that are not really in the things themselves. The yellowness is not really in the marker that I'm looking at. The yellowness is in my mind only. What's in the marker is just the physical primary qualities, right? Which cause the experience of yellowness in my mind, right? Which cause light to be reflected off it in the frequency by which it's reflected off it and so forth, which produces that specific color. Yeah. So that's the case of color as an example. We should talk about other examples like sound, right? Hearing, obviously. And you can think of more on your own. Okay. Then the third one is the tertiary quality. That's the power that is in any body by reason of the particular constitution of its primary qualities to make such a change in the bulk, texture, figure, and motion of another body, so as to make it operate on our senses differently from what it did before. This is just the power of one thing out there to change another thing. Yeah? So if I have a hot frying pan and I lay this yellow marker on it, then the hot frying pan has the power to melt the marker and make it black and make it appear to me differently, so that the marker will produce different ideas in me from what it did before, because it got melted, right? So to put it simply, the secondary quality is the power a thing has because of its primary qualities to affect a change or to put some idea in my mind. Yeah? The tertiary quality is the power that a thing has because of its primary qualities to create a change in the qualities of another thing, another body. Yeah? And so there we have our three qualities. Okay. So we had ideas and we have qualities. And lastly here, we'll sort of tie this up. I mean, of course, this is quite a large book, and Locke said a lot of things, and there's a lot of details, and we, of course, can't cover that all. We just cover the basic ideas and try to give you a sort of sense of his overall viewpoint, which has come to be called representative realism. Representative realism is the theory that the things we experience, our ideas of secondary qualities, are not the same as the real things, but represent the real things by being caused by them. That is their primary quality. Okay? So, going back to our discussion of Descartes, where really this story kind of starts, we recall that Descartes had his sort of skeptical, entertained the doubt that perhaps everything he experiences is merely a dream or hallucination, right? And put in these terms, that would be this doubt that perhaps everything he experiences is merely an idea in his mind and does not correspond to anything out there, right? And if that were the case, we would say, or he would say, it's not real. So we wouldn't be realists about the objects of our experience, right? And if we're not realists about the objects of our experience, of course, that means that knowledge can't be about or come from the objects of our experience, right? As Plato said, if they're just shadows in a cave, then we really can't get knowledge from the shadows, right? At best, we can just sort of, the shadows can indicate to us something behind them, which is the light, right? So therefore, the reality and the light and the truth, right, which sort of grounds our knowledge, is something independent of experience, but which experience is merely a reflection or a shadow of, yeah? And that would be a non-realist view, probably in the strictest sense of the objects of our experience. In the most thorough sense, right, it would be if, as Descartes wondered, everything is a dream or a hallucination, everything that we experience has completely no connection to reality at all, which obviously is not the case really in Plato's scheme, right? And if Descartes' nightmare was true, and there's an evil, all-powerful demon who is, implanting all our experiences and our ideas in us as a part of a kind of a conspiracy to deceive us, then the objects of experience are even less real, right? Because then they're not even shadows or reflections of any reality or truth. They're actually complete deceptions, right? And of course, Descartes doesn't think that's the case, but we have to remember that he entertained that possibility as a sort of methodological test to determine the reliability of the sources of knowledge that he was examining. Yeah. But here we have a kind of a similar notion that Descartes actually arrived at, but through a different way. Yeah. Descartes really wanted to prove it a priori. As a rationalist, he needed to prove that the objects of our experience are, give us knowledge, usually, on the basis of some argument which is independent of experience. Yeah. For the empiricist like Locke, no kind of argument totally independent of experience can really be made, because all our ideas and knowledge come from experience, and so we have to construct this from the basis of experience itself. And he believes he started by, he has done this by sort of doing his classification and taxonomy and analysis of the ideas that we have, and showing how they are all originate in experience alone. Yeah. But it's his distinction between the ideas and the qualities of things, and the different classifications of qualities, specifically the distinction between the primary qualities and the secondary qualities, that allow him to propose the representative realism. Yeah. If he were to be let's say a complete realist about experience, then he would be committed to the proposition that the things we experience are actually the real things, that the things we experience are identical to the real things, and that doesn't seem plausible, simply because our experience changes in a way that is incompatible with what seems to us to be a requirement of a things being real, right? So if we were in class, and I think I might have done that in class the first day, right? We discussed the distinction between appearance and reality. We could move around the room and notice that it appears to be the case that things get larger, right, as you get nearer to them, and that they get smaller as you move away from them, right? And so what you experience actually changes in size. It gets larger and smaller all the time. And if the objects of your experience were exactly the same as the real things, they're identical to the real things, then that means that things always change size as you move around, which would be very strange, right? So there has to be a distinction between the real things, and our experience of them. But it has to be one which such that, our experience really gives us knowledge. And so right? The theory here then is that experience gives us knowledge because the objects of our experience represent the real objects, even though they're not identical to the real objects. And they represent those real things because they're caused by them. And that is what the role of the distinction between the primary qualities and the secondary qualities is. Because the primary qualities, right, again, are the qualities that a thing has intrinsically, in as much as it is a material thing. The secondary qualities are its power to produce certain ideas in us on the basis of or because of the primary qualities that it has. And so it produces, and that's how it produces the ideas in us. And the ideas in our minds are the objects of experience, right, from which we get the knowledge. It's the causal relation between the qualities, between the primary qualities of a thing and the ideas that we actually experience in our mind, which provides the link to reality that our experience needs in order for it to provide us knowledge of reality, right? Without that link, then we might be still in the situation of, Descartes' skeptical nightmare, where we just have experience in our minds, and as far as we know, it could be just a sort of hallucination or permanent dream or something like that, and there's nothing outside of those experiences which it's an experience of and which is real, so that we could say our experience is true. Locke finds that link that's needed here in this idea of the things out there causing ideas in us. So our ideas, the things in our mind, represent real things because what's in our minds is caused by those real things, not because what's in our mind is identical to those real things, right? Actually, what's in our mind differs from the actual nature of the real things in certain ways, but by understanding the nature of the causal link between those things in the world and the ideas that we experience in our mind, we can arrive at knowledge of those things, right? By examining the experience in light of what we know about how things affect our experience. And the most simple example is the one I just gave. By knowing that when we move closer to something, it appears to us larger, and when we move away from something, it appears to us smaller, we can correctly interpret our experience, right? And arrive at the true notion of the things outside us, right? Rather than the false notion that we would arrive at if we were to be straightforward realists and think that the objects of our experience are the real things. Yes, so that's the concept of representative realism, which is a metaphysical position about the objects of our experience. And that metaphysical position or ontological position about the objects of our experience is part and parcel of Locke's empiricism, because the empiricism, again, is an epistemological view according to which knowledge is derived from experience, and that experience is all we need for knowledge, and therefore that means that the objects of our experience have to have some ontological status, have to be real in some sense, right? Because if they're not real in some sense, they can't give us knowledge. Knowledge is of the real. So they're real in a representative sense, as we see. Okay, so not on the surface totally different from the conclusion that Descartes arrived at, except for the crucial fact that Descartes believed that one can only arrive at knowledge of the real things on the basis of what's been experienced, because of the fact that there are innate ideas in the mind and innate capacities of the mind that have to be applied to experience, right, and which are independent of experience. And only by applying those things would we be able to distinguish between the things as they really are and as they merely appear to us. Whereas for Descartes, that distinction between the appearance of things and their actual reality can be made completely by means of the tools available to us from experience alone, and don't require anything prior to experience, right, or independent of experience, that, whether it's an innate idea or something else. Because again, the mind for him is a blank slate when a person's born, and all the information that comes in comes from experience afterwards. Yeah. So that sort of sums up the story, and the next empiricist we will discuss will be Berkeley. So please do that reading and reflect on this and try to understand as well as you can the idea of representative realism, because when we come to talk about Berkeley, that will be a crucial thing. Okay?